The fuel gauge read low. Colonel Don Blakesley glanced at it, then looked back through the P-51B's canopy at something impossible. Berlin stretched out below him, gray sprawl meeting hazy horizon. March 4, 1944. 11:23 in the morning. No American fighter had ever been here, not at this altitude, not this deep. 3 years of war had brought him to this moment. He'd flown Spitfires with the RAF's Eagle squadrons back, when America sat on the sidelines. He'd watched good men die over the Channel, over French farmland, over the flat countries. Now he was 600 miles from England, nursing a formation of heavy bombers straight into the belly of the Reich. His guns had jammed somewhere past Hanover. Made no difference. He stayed up front anyway. That's what leaders did. His boys needed to see his plane out there. Proof that if he could make it, they could too. What Blakesley couldn't know, what none of them knew, was that German commanders were watching from below. Those long-nosed American fighters, circling lazily over the capital, told them something all the intelligence briefs and production charts hadn't conveyed. They were finished. Hermann Göring would later tell his interrogators about that moment. Different people recorded his words differently. Some said he knew the jig was up. Others remembered him saying the war was lost. The exact phrasing shifted over time, but the core meaning never changed. The Reich's most powerful air commander had watched American fighters over his capital and understood what came next. This is how one aircraft, born from British desperation and American industry, transformed from disappointment to war winner. It's about the men who flew it, the men who built it, and the men who died before it could save them. It's about how a single airplane bent history. To understand why Mustangs over Berlin mattered, you need to understand what came before. You need to understand Black Thursday, October 14, 1943. 291 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted off from eastern England and turned toward Germany. Target, Schweinfurt, a small Bavarian city, producing nearly half of all ball bearings feeding German industry. Ball bearings went into everything. Tank turrets, aircraft engines, submarine propellers. Destroy the ball bearing factories, American planners figured, and you crippled the German war machine. The bombers flew tight formations, gunners manning 50 caliber machine guns covering every angle. The doctrine said they'd protect themselves. Mass defensive firepower would drive off attackers. The doctrine was about to fail catastrophically. The problem was range. American escorts, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, could only go so far. They'd accompany the bombers partway into Germany. Then fuel forced them home. The bombers continued alone. The Luftwaffe knew this. They'd learned exactly where American fighters reached their limit. They positioned interceptors just beyond that line and waited. When the Thunderbolts turned back somewhere over the German border, the killing started. German fighters hit in waves. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s came from every direction. Some attacked head-on, cannon shells tearing through cockpit glass, killing pilots in their seats. Others positioned off to the side, firing rockets into packed formations. Explosions sent bombers tumbling out of control, trailing fire and smoke, crews bailing into frozen air or dying where they sat. The bomber crews fought back hard. Their gunners claimed 186 German fighters destroyed that day. The number was wildly inflated. Actual German losses, 35 to 38 aircraft. In exchange, the Luftwaffe shot down 60 American bombers. Another 17 damaged beyond repair. 121 more returned with battle damage. 600 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured in one afternoon. Loss rate, over 20%. At that rate, no bomber crew could survive their required 25 mission tour. The math was brutal. Send a man up 25 times with 20% loss per mission. His odds of coming home were essentially zero. The human cost extended beyond the dead. Every bomber carried 10 crew. Each had families back home, parents and wives and sweethearts, who'd received telegrams starting with the Secretary of War desires to express his deepest regret. Some families would learn months later their sons or husbands survived as POWs. Many would never know exactly what happened. For crews who survived and returned to England, the psychological toll was crushing. They'd watched friends burn. They'd seen parachutes fail to open, men tumbling through 30,000 feet of empty sky. They'd felt their own aircraft shudder under cannon fire, smelled burning hydraulic fluid, felt cold wind blast through torn fuselage. And they knew tomorrow or the next day they'd do it again. The 8th Air Force had been shattered. Deep penetration raids into Germany without fighter escort were suspended immediately. The bombers wouldn't return to Schweinfurt for 4 months. The suspension wasn't officially called defeat, but it amounted to the same thing. American strategic doctrine called for daylight precision bombing of key industrial targets. That doctrine required penetrating deep into enemy territory without fighter escort. Such penetrations were suicide. The British had faced this problem earlier and reached a different conclusion. After devastating losses in daylight raids during 1939 and 1940, RAF Bomber Command switched to night operations. Flying under darkness, British bombers could reach German cities without facing Luftwaffe fighters. The cost was accuracy. Unable to see targets clearly, British bombers attacked cities as a whole rather than specific factories. Morally controversial, strategically uncertain, but survivable. RAF crews had reasonable odds of completing their tours. The Americans had rejected this approach. They believed their heavy bombers, with sophisticated Norden bomb sights and mass defensive firepower, could operate effectively in daylight. They believed precision attacks on specific targets would prove more effective than area bombing. They believed, essentially, they could succeed where the British failed. Black Thursday shattered those beliefs. The Norden bomb sight was indeed accurate, but accuracy meant nothing if bombers got shot down before reaching targets. Mass defensive firepower was formidable, but not enough to stop determined German interceptors. Everything Americans believed about operating without fighter escort was wrong. General Henry Arnold, commander of Army Air Forces, publicly called the loss of 60 bombers incidental. Reality told a different story. Unescorted daylight bomber raids deep into Germany were suspended indefinitely. The entire strategic bombing campaign, cornerstone of Allied strategy to defeat Nazi Germany, teetered on collapse. The bomber generals had promised daylight precision bombing could win the war. Now those promises looked like fantasies. Without long-range fighter escort, bombers couldn't survive. And no long-range fighter existed. Or so everyone believed. The cost of those beliefs could be measured in empty beds and unfinished letters home. In every bomber group across England, survival mathematics became a constant, unspoken presence. A man might look around his barracks at night and count faces unlikely to be there by Christmas. The odds were that stark, that inescapable. The problem wasn't courage. American bomber crews had courage in abundance. They climbed into aircraft day after day, knowing the odds were against them. Knowing statistical analysis gave them no realistic chance of completing tours. They went anyway. The problem was fundamental limitations of the aircraft they flew and the doctrine governing how they flew it. The B-17 Flying Fortress was an engineering marvel. It could fly higher than most contemporary fighters, carry thousands of pounds of bombs hundreds of miles, absorb tremendous damage, and still bring its crew home. Its 1350 caliber machine guns covered every angle of approach. A formation of B-17s, properly flown, was indeed a formidable defensive system. But not formidable enough. German pilots had developed tactics specifically to defeat bomber formations. They attacked from the front where defensive firepower was weakest, and where a direct hit on the cockpit killed pilots instantly. They used rockets fired from beyond machine gun range to break up formations, then picked off stragglers one by one. They concentrated attacks on wounded bombers fallen out of position, knowing isolated aircraft were easy prey. Against these tactics, bomber doctrine had no answer. The only real solution was friendly fighters present to drive off attackers. But fighters couldn't be present because no fighter had the range. It seemed like a problem with no solution. The airplane that would change everything had been sitting in hangars across England for 2 years, dismissed as a disappointment. The North American P-51 Mustang was born in 1940, designed and built in just 102 days to meet a British purchasing request. The British needed fighters desperately, and American Curtiss P-40 production lines were running at capacity. North American Aviation offered to design something better, faster. The original Mustang was beautiful, sleek, and fast, with an innovative laminar flow wing that reduced drag. But it had one critical flaw. Its Allison V1710 engine performed well at low altitude, but lost power above 15,000 feet. At heights where bombers flew, and where combat against the Luftwaffe took place, the Mustang was simply too slow. The problem was the supercharger. The Allison engine used a single-stage supercharger with a critical altitude of only 11,800 feet. Above that height, the engine couldn't compress enough thin air to maintain power. The Mustang would start strong in a climb, then gradually fall behind as altitude increased. By the time it reached 20,000 feet, where bombers cruised and German interceptors lurked, the Mustang was gasping. The Royal Air Force used its Mustangs for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance roles, where high-altitude performance didn't matter. The aircraft was considered a nice design with a disappointing engine, seemingly destined to remain a footnote in aviation history. Then, on April 30, 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker visited the Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Duxford and asked to fly one of the American fighters. He took the Mustang up for 30 minutes, ringing it through its paces, and came down with an idea that would transform the war. The airplane, Harker reported, was magnificent below 15,000 feet, fast, maneuverable, with excellent range. Its only weakness was altitude performance, and that weakness came from the engine. The Allison simply couldn't deliver power in thin air, but Rolls-Royce had an engine that could. The Merlin 60 series with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger was the power plant that made the Spitfire competitive at any altitude. What if you took the Mustang airframe and replaced its Allison engine with a Merlin? Harker immediately phoned Ray Dorey, head of Rolls-Royce's experimental division, to advocate for the conversion. His superiors were intrigued. By June 1942, Rolls-Royce had begun converting Mustang airframes to Merlin power at their facility in Hucknall. The first converted aircraft, designated the Mustang X, flew on October 13, 1942. The results were nothing short of spectacular. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. That was more than 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version at the same altitude. The aircraft could climb almost twice as fast. And crucially, it retained the original Mustang's exceptional range, a quality that came from its efficient aerodynamic design and large internal fuel tanks. The engineering explanation was straightforward. The Merlin 60 series engine had a two-stage supercharger with an intercooler that maintained power at high altitude where air was thin. The Allison had only a single-stage supercharger optimized for lower altitudes. At 15,000 feet, both engines produced similar power. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin was producing full-rated horsepower, while the Allison was gasping. But the transformation involved more than swapping engines. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison and required different cowling to accommodate its larger supercharger. The aircraft's center of gravity had to be adjusted by moving the wings slightly forward. New intake designs were needed for the intercooler. The propeller was changed from 3 blades to 4 to absorb the additional power. North American Aviation's engineers worked through these problems with remarkable speed. The company that had designed the original Mustang in 102 days proved equally capable of redesigning it in months rather than years. The key was collaboration. British and American engineers shared information freely, with Rolls-Royce providing detailed specifications for the Merlin and North American adapting their airframe to accommodate it. Major Thomas Hitchcock, the American assistant air attaché in London, served as a crucial liaison, ensuring promising technical developments were communicated to the right people on both sides of the Atlantic. Hitchcock was an unusual figure for a wartime diplomatic post. A wealthy polo player and investment banker before the war, he'd flown combat missions in the First World War as a teenager, escaped from a German POW camp, and walked 100 miles to Switzerland. He understood both aviation technology and combat requirements, and he championed the Merlin Mustang project with bureaucratic skill. He predicted the Merlin Mustang would be the best fighter of 1943. Tragically, Hitchcock was killed in a flying accident in April 1944, just weeks after the first Mustangs reached Berlin. He died testing P-51 dive characteristics near Salisbury, England, unable to pull out of a high-speed dive while investigating the same instability problems that had killed other pilots. He never saw the full impact of the aircraft he'd done so much to promote. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could fly all the way to Berlin, fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms, and fly all the way home. North American aviation in California had been thinking along similar lines. Working with Packard, which was licensed building Merlin engines in Detroit, they developed their own conversion. The first American Merlin Mustang, designated the XP-51B, flew on November 30, 1942. The U.S. Army Air Forces were so impressed they ordered 400 P-51Bs in August 1942, before a single Merlin Mustang had even flown. It was a gamble, but the need was desperate and the preliminary calculations were promising. Production began in earnest in 1943. The first P-51Bs arrived in England with the 354th Fighter Group in November. These aircraft, originally assigned to the 9th Air Force for tactical operations, were immediately pressed into service as bomber escorts by the 8th Air Force. The transformation of the American fighter force happened with remarkable speed. In December 1943, the 8th Air Force had only a handful of Mustangs. By March 1944, entire fighter groups were converting. By June, the P-51 equipped the majority of American escort squadrons in England. The logistics were staggering. Each Mustang needed spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and trained ground crews. Pilots had to be converted from whatever they'd been flying before, learning the quirks of the new aircraft, its capabilities and limitations, its tricks for survival. Some pilots adapted faster than others. Don Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group received their P-51Bs on February 25, 1944. When higher command expressed concern that the group wasn't ready, Blakesley insisted his pilots would learn to fly the Mustang on the way to the target. 3 days later, on February 28th, the group flew its first Mustang combat mission. The change in tactics came from the top. In January 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was famous for leading the first American bombing raid on Tokyo in 1942. But his most important contribution to the air war would be a simple change in fighter doctrine. The fighters would no longer be tied to the bombers, Doolittle announced. Their job wasn't merely to protect the formations. Their job was to destroy the Luftwaffe. It was a fundamental shift in doctrine. Under the old rules, escort fighters stayed close to the bombers, weaving above them in protective patterns. They engaged German interceptors only when those interceptors threatened the bombers directly. This defensive posture surrendered initiative to the Luftwaffe. German pilots could choose when and where to attack, could set up assault runs unmolested, could concentrate on bombers while ignoring escorts. Doolittle's new doctrine reversed everything. American fighters would now fly ahead of bomber formations, seeking out German interceptors and attacking them before they could reach the bombers. They'd strafe German airfields. They'd hunt the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. The bomber crews were horrified. They saw their protective umbrella being stripped away, their little friends abandoning them to chase glory in individual dogfights. But Doolittle understood something bomber crews couldn't see from their gun positions. The only way to protect bombers in the long term was to destroy the German fighter force. Not just the airplanes, but the pilots. Germany could build new fighters. Replacing experienced pilots took years. The stage was set for the decisive air battle of the European War. The offensive began on February 20, 1944. Operation Argument, officially. History would remember it as Big Week. For 6 days, the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force flying from bases in Italy threw everything they had at German aircraft factories. The targets were carefully chosen: Messerschmitt plants at Regensburg and Augsburg, Focke-Wulf facilities at Ostersleben and Tutto, Junkers factories at Bernburg, ball bearing plants that had been left alone since Black Thursday. The scale of operations was unprecedented. On February 20th alone, more than 1,000 bombers took off from English and Italian bases. Fighter escorts numbered in the hundreds. The Luftwaffe had never faced anything like it. General Frederick Anderson, who planned the offensive, explained the strategy. The goal was to force the Germans to fight, to make them put every airplane they had into the air to defend those factories. Because once they were in the air, American fighters could get at them. It was a brutal calculation. The bombers were bait, flying deep into Germany to draw out defenders. The fighters were the real weapon, tasked with destroying German interceptors who rose to attack the bombers. Every bomber lost was a tragedy for its crew. But if the fighters killed enough German pilots in exchange, the strategy would succeed. The weather during Big Week was terrible, with low clouds and icing conditions that forced many bombers to abort missions or attack secondary targets. Navigation errors led to tragic mistakes, including the accidental bombing of Dutch cities that killed hundreds of civilians. War is never clean, and the combined bomber offensive was grimly costly for everyone involved. More than 3,000 bomber sorties were flown during the 6 days of Big Week. The 8th Air Force alone lost 137 heavy bombers, with another 20 scrapped due to damage. The 15th lost 90. RAF Bomber Command, attacking the same targets at night, lost between 131 and 157 aircraft, depending on how losses were counted. The losses were heavy in absolute terms, but they represented a much smaller percentage of the attacking force than Black Thursday. The American bomber force was growing faster than the Germans could shoot it down, and the fighters were doing their work. The Luftwaffe threw everything into the defense. Twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Me-410s, heavily armed but slow, tried to break up bomber formations with rockets and heavy cannon. Single-engine Bf-109s and FW-190s provided escort for the heavy fighters and attacked any bombers that strayed from formation. But now they faced the Mustangs. The Germans had no answer for American tactics. Their heavy fighters, loaded with rockets and cannon, couldn't maneuver against the nimble Mustangs. Their single-engine fighters, designed for short-range interception, found themselves outranged and outnumbered. For every American fighter the Luftwaffe shot down, it lost 3 or 4 of its own. The Merlin Mustang's performance advantages were overwhelming at the altitudes where combat took place. At 25,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 441 miles per hour, while the Bf-109 struggled to match 390. The Mustang could dive faster, climb faster, and turn tighter than anything the Germans put against it. And unlike German fighters, which had to land and refuel after 45 minutes of combat, the Mustang could fight for hours and still have fuel to spare. American pilots quickly learned to exploit these advantages. They developed tactics that maximized the Mustang's strengths, while minimizing exposure to the German fighters' remaining advantages. High-speed slashing attacks from above became the standard approach. Dive on the enemy, fire a quick burst, and zoom back up to altitude before they could respond. The Germans called it boom and zoom. Whatever they called it, it was killing them. Worse, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots it couldn't replace. During Big Week, more than 100 experienced German fighter pilots were killed or captured. These weren't fresh trainees, but veterans with dozens of missions, men who'd been fighting since the Battle of Britain or the invasion of Russia. Their skills had been honed over years of combat. Now they were gone, and the pilots who replaced them had a fraction of their experience. The German training pipeline was already struggling. Fuel shortages had cut training hours drastically. New pilots were arriving at frontline units with barely 160 hours of flight time, less than half of what their American counterparts received. These inexperienced pilots were fed into the meat grinder of the air war, and most didn't survive their first few missions. By the end of February, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 30% of its fighter aircraft in Western Europe. The losses in March would be even worse. March 4, 1944. The first American escort mission to Berlin. Colonel Don Blakesley led his 4th Fighter Group from their base at Debden, 40 miles north of London. The pilots had been flying their P-51BS for just a week. Some had only a few hours in the new aircraft. When higher command expressed concern that the group wasn't ready, Blakesley's response was characteristic. His pilots would learn to fly the Mustang on the way to the target. Approximately 30 bombers of the 13th Combat Bomb Wing set out that morning, escorted by 28 Mustangs. The target was the German capital itself, the symbolic heart of the Nazi regime. Every German fighter within range would rise to defend it. The Americans were counting on that. The weather turned bad over Germany, limiting the effectiveness of the bombing. But the fighters pressed on, and for the first time, American single-engine fighters flew over the city that had been untouchable for so long. The German defenders were shocked. Ground controllers tracking the American formation kept reporting their position, expecting them to turn back at any moment. When the fighters kept coming, pushing deeper and deeper into Germany, the controllers refused to believe their own radar. American single-engine fighters couldn't reach Berlin. Everyone knew that. 2 days later, on March 6th, the full attack came. 800 bombers, escorted by more than 900 fighters, struck Berlin in the largest daylight raid of the war to that point. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. The fighting was savage. 69 American bombers were shot down, the highest single-day loss since Black Thursday. But this time, there was a difference. The escorts were there all the way to the target and all the way back. And the Luftwaffe paid for every bomber it destroyed. 160 German fighters were shot down on March 6th alone. The exchange rate was roughly 2 to 1 in favor of the Americans, a dramatic reversal from the dark days of October. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group shot down 3 German fighters over Berlin that day, bringing his total to 18 victories. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, got 2 more. The 2 of them had become the most feared team in the 8th Air Force, flying together, protecting each other's blind spots. They developed an almost telepathic coordination that made them deadly. They were just getting started. Back at Debden after the mission, a reporter from the New York Times caught Captain Pierce McKinnon outside the 335th Squadron dispersal and asked if they'd met up with any German fighters. McKinnon's reply became legendary. Millions, boy. Millions. But the real significance of the Berlin raids wasn't the bombers that got through or the fighters that were shot down. It was simpler than that. American fighters were over Berlin. For 3 years, Hermann Göring had promised the German people that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the capital. When British bombers proved him wrong in 1940, he said no enemy would fly over Berlin by day. Now American fighters circled freely over the city, their propellers glinting in the spring sunlight, visible proof that the Luftwaffe could no longer defend German airspace. The psychological impact was devastating. German civilians who'd believed in the invincibility of their air force now watched American aircraft overhead with impunity. German pilots, who'd once been hunters, now found themselves hunted. The Luftwaffe's commander had been a fighter ace himself in the First World War, one of the best Germany produced. He'd led the legendary Richthofen Circus after the Red Baron's death. He understood air combat at a fundamental level. He also understood logistics. A fighter over Berlin meant a fighter that had taken off in England, flown 600 miles across occupied Europe, fought its way through German defenses, and still had enough fuel to fly 600 miles home. The only way to do that was with an aircraft that had extraordinary range. The Germans had nothing comparable. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was an excellent fighter, but it was designed for short-range operations. Even with drop tanks, it couldn't match the Mustang's reach. The Focke-Wulf FW 190 had similar limitations. German pilots were fighting over their own territory, within sight of their own airfields, and they were still being outranged by American escorts. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of the fighter arm, later described the moment when he personally confirmed what Göring feared. When reports came in that American single-engine fighters were over Berlin, the official position was that it was impossible. There were no long-range escort fighters. Some staff officers suggested the American pilots must have gotten lost, or perhaps they were planning to crash land in Sweden. Galland decided to see for himself. He took off in his Focke-Wulf with another general, and they flew toward where the Americans were reported. They found them over Germany, exactly where they weren't supposed to be. The Americans found them too. According to Galland's own memoir, he escaped by firing his guns and using the smoke and shell casings to convince the pursuing Mustangs that someone was shooting at them from behind. The other general was shot down. There were no more arguments about whether American fighters could reach Berlin. The killing continued through the spring of 1944. April 8th was one of the bloodiest days for the Luftwaffe. The 4th Fighter Group alone claimed 33 German aircraft destroyed, the highest single mission total for any American unit in the war. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 200 fighters that day. The Germans tried to adapt. They developed new tactics, new formations, new ways of attacking the bomber streams. They rushed improved aircraft into service, including the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. None of it mattered. The fundamental problem was attrition. Every day, the Luftwaffe lost pilots. Every day, their replacements were less experienced. Every day, the Americans grew stronger as new groups arrived from the training pipeline. By May 1944, German fighter pilot training had been cut to just 112 hours, barely enough to learn basic flying skills. American pilots arrived at their units with 450 hours or more. In combat, experience was survival. The green German pilots died in droves. The numbers told the story. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 17% of its fighter pilots. In February, another 18%. In March, approximately 22%. In April, similar losses continued. In May, 25%. An air force cannot sustain such monthly casualties and remain effective. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm was bleeding to death. The Germans tried everything to slow the bleeding. They rushed new aircraft designs into production. They reorganized their fighter units to concentrate strength at critical points. They developed heavy fighter formations specifically designed to break through the escort screen and reach the bombers. None of it worked. The Sturmgruppen were the most dramatic response. These were units equipped with heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s, their pilots sworn to close to point-blank range and destroy bombers or die trying. The armor added weight and reduced performance, making these aircraft easy prey for Mustangs. But the Sturmgruppen pilots pressed home their attacks with fanatic determination. Some succeeded. Individual bomber groups suffered terribly when Sturmgruppen broke through their escort. But for every bomber destroyed, multiple German fighters were lost. The exchange rate was never in Germany's favor. The problem wasn't tactics or equipment or even courage. The problem was numbers. America was producing pilots faster than Germany could kill them. Germany was losing pilots faster than it could replace them. Every week, the disparity grew wider. Every week, the Luftwaffe grew weaker. And June was coming. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history. 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and stormed the beaches of Normandy. They were supported by nearly 12,000 aircraft, the greatest concentration of air power ever assembled. Fighters flew continuous patrols over the beaches. Bombers struck German positions inland. Transport aircraft dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines. The Luftwaffe's response was tragically inadequate. The most famous German attack of the day came from Oberleutnant Joseph Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26. He and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wudersick, took off from their base near Lille and flew west toward the beaches. They dodged Allied formations, found the invasion fleet spread across the horizon, and made a single strafing pass over what the British called Sword Beach. Priller's attack became legendary, later immortalized in film. But while it was the most dramatic Luftwaffe response of the morning, it wasn't the only one. Other German aircraft flew sorties throughout the day, including attacks by Kampfgeschwader 54 on British positions. Yet the total German effort remained pitiful compared to the Allied armada overhead. For the entire day, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over Normandy. The Allies flew 14,674. The ratio was approximately 46-1. General Eisenhower had promised his troops before the invasion, "If you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours." It wasn't bravado. It was simple fact. The air superiority that made D-Day possible had been won in the spring of 1944, won by Mustang pilots over Berlin and Leipzig and Brunswick and Frankfurt, won by bomber crews who served as bait to draw the Luftwaffe into battle, won by mechanics and armorers who kept the planes flying and the guns firing. The price had been high. Thousands of American airmen died in the skies over Germany. But they'd accomplished something no air force had ever done. They destroyed the enemy's ability to contest the sky. In the weeks following D-Day, the consequences of Luftwaffe weakness became brutally apparent. German armored divisions trying to reach the front were pounded from the air. Tank columns that moved by day were attacked by swarms of Allied fighter bombers. Artillery positions that revealed themselves were immediately targeted. Supply convoys were shot to pieces. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in Normandy, wrote despairingly to his wife, "The enemy has complete control of the air over the battle area and up to about 100 kilometers behind the front. Every movement of any significance during the day draws bombing and strafing." German generals tried to adapt by moving only at night, but this slowed their operations catastrophically. Reinforcements that should have reached the front in hours took days instead. Counterattacks that required precise timing became impossible to coordinate. The breakthrough at St. Lo in late July shattered the German defensive line in Normandy. Allied armored columns poured through the gap, racing across France at speeds German intelligence couldn't track. Paris was liberated in August. By September, Allied forces were approaching the German border. All of this was possible because the Luftwaffe couldn't intervene. German fighters that rose to contest the Allied advance were shot down by the ever-present Mustangs. German ground attack aircraft were hunted before they could reach their targets. German reconnaissance planes were destroyed before they could report Allied movements. The war continued for 11 more months after D-Day. The Luftwaffe never recovered. German aircraft production actually peaked in September 1944, turning out nearly 4,000 fighters in a single month. But there weren't enough pilots to fly them, not enough fuel to train new pilots, not enough experienced leaders to teach them how to survive. The jets arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied fighter, but it was complex and unreliable, and its pilots were often inexperienced men who had no business flying the most advanced aircraft in the world. By January 1945, new German fighter pilots were arriving at their units, with as little as 50 hours of total flight time. Many crashed on their first operational flights before they ever saw an enemy aircraft. The Mustang squadrons, meanwhile, ranged freely over Germany. They shot down German fighters wherever they found them. They strafed airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. They attacked trains and trucks and anything else that moved. The strategic bombing campaign, so close to failure in October 1943, achieved its objectives. German oil production collapsed under sustained attacks. German industry, dispersed and hidden though it was, couldn't keep pace with the destruction. German cities burned. When the war ended in May 1945, American pilots in Europe had claimed nearly 5,000 German aircraft destroyed in air combat. The Mustang accounted for the majority of those victories. Hermann Göring survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945 and was tried at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. During his captivity, He was interviewed extensively about the air war. In those interrogations, recorded in the USAF Air Intelligence Summary of June 1945, Göring stated that when long-range fighters appeared over Berlin, he knew the eventual results would be tragic. He credited long-range fighters with delivering a major strategic blow to German planning and considered them collectively as one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war. The Reichsmarschall, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, had watched American fighters over his capital city and understood the war was unwinnable. All the promises of Nazi propaganda, all the boasts of German technological superiority, all the claims of inevitable victory collapsed in that moment. The Allies could reach anywhere. The Luftwaffe could stop nothing. Göring was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. He cheated the hangman by taking cyanide the night before his execution. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, survived the war as well. He'd been relieved of his command in January 1945 after repeated conflicts with Göring over the conduct of the air war. Given permission to return to combat flying, he formed a special unit of jet pilots that flew Me-262s in the final weeks of the war. After the war, Galland worked as a consultant to the Argentine Air Force and later ran his own business in Germany. He became friends with many of his former enemies, including British ace Douglas Bader and American ace Robert Johnson. He died in 1996 at the age of 83. He never forgot the day he flew up to see the American fighters for himself and barely escaped with his life. Don Blakesley, the colonel who led the first Mustangs over Berlin, flew more than 500 combat missions in the war. He accumulated over 1,000 hours of combat flying time, more than any other American fighter pilot. He was grounded on October 30, 1944, against his will. General William Kepner, his superior, had lost too many experienced leaders and couldn't afford to lose another. That same day, Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the legendary 56 Fighter Group, had gone down when his P-47's wing failed in a violent storm over Germany. Zemke survived and was captured by the Germans, but his loss was a shock to the entire fighter command. When Blakesley landed from what turned out to be his last mission, Kepner was waiting on the flight line. "You're grounded," the general told him. "I can't afford to lose both of you." Blakesley stayed in the Air Force after the war, serving in Korea and eventually retiring as a colonel. He died in 2008 at the age of 90. One of the last surviving leaders of the air war over Germany. His pilots, the men of the 4th Fighter Group, finished the war as one of the highest-scoring American units in any theater. They claimed 583 enemy aircraft shot down in air combat with a victory-to-loss ratio of more than 2 to 1. The group had come a long way from the Eagle Squadron volunteers who flew Spitfires when America was still at peace. The 4th wasn't the only group that distinguished itself. The 56 Fighter Group, flying P-47s for most of the war, destroyed more German aircraft in air combat than any other 8th Air Force Fighter Group. The 354th Fighter Group, the first to receive Mustangs in England, pioneered many of the escort tactics that other groups adopted. The 357th, the 359th, the 339th each had their own aces, their own traditions, their own battles won and lost. Behind the kills and mission counts were thousands of individual stories. Young men from every state in America, most barely out of their teens, learned to fly high-performance aircraft and went to war against the most experienced fighter force in the world. Some became famous. Captain Clarence Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group shot down 16 and a quarter German aircraft and survived 2 complete combat tours without ever being hit. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the highest-scoring Mustang aces before being killed by friendly fire on Christmas Day, 1944. Captain John Godfrey, Don Gentile's wingman, compiled 18 victories before being shot down and captured in August 1944. Most weren't famous. They did their jobs, flew their missions, and if they were lucky, went home when their tours were complete. The ones who died were mourned by their squadron mates, and then replaced by fresh faces from the training pipeline. War doesn't wait for grief. The ground crews deserved as much credit as the pilots. These men worked in all weather, often through the night, to keep the fighters flying. They patched bullet holes, replaced worn parts, loaded ammunition, and refueled aircraft in conditions ranging from freezing mud to summer heat. A Mustang without a ground crew was useless. The pilots knew this and were grateful for it. The relationship between a pilot and his crew chief was often the closest bond on the base. The crew chief lived with that airplane, knew every quirk and rattle, could diagnose problems by the sound of the engine. When a pilot failed to return, the crew chief felt the loss as personally as any squadron mate. And when a pilot came back with his aircraft shot full of holes, the crew chief would work through the night to have it ready for the next mission. The early P-51Bs had their share of mechanical problems. The guns, mounted at an angle to fit inside the thin wing, tended to jam under high G loads. Engine temperatures ran hot during ground operations. The canopy design created blind spots that German fighters could exploit. Ground crews and pilots worked together to solve these problems, developing field modifications that eventually made their way back to the factory. The later P-51D, with its bubble canopy and improved gun installation, was partly the product of combat experience fed back through these channels. The P-51 Mustang continued flying long after the war ended. It served in Korea, where it flew ground attack missions in the opening months of the conflict. It served with air forces around the world, remaining operational in some countries until the 1980s. More than 15,000 Mustangs were built during the war, with some sources counting as many as 15,500, including variants produced under license. The P-51D model alone accounted for more than 8,000 aircraft, more than half of total production. Thousands more survive today, many still flying at air shows and commemorative events. The distinctive growl of the Merlin engine has become one of the most recognizable sounds in aviation. But the Mustang's true legacy isn't the aircraft that survive. It's the victory it made possible. Before the Mustang, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was failing. American bombers couldn't survive deep penetration raids without fighter escort, and no fighter had the range to escort them. The doctrine of self-defending bomber formations had been proven wrong at terrible cost. The Mustang changed everything. It gave the bombers the protection they needed. More importantly, it gave the Americans a weapon that could destroy the Luftwaffe fighter force, not just in the air, but on the ground and in the training schools where new pilots were supposed to be produced. The air superiority won by the Mustang, and its pilots made D-Day possible. It made the advance across France possible. It made the crossing of the Rhine possible. Every major Allied ground operation from June 1944 onward depended on control of the sky, and control of the sky belonged to the P-51. When Hermann Göring saw those American fighters over Berlin, he understood what was coming. The invasion, the collapse, the defeat, the destruction of everything the Nazi regime had built. It was all there in that moment, visible to anyone who knew how to read the signs. The Mustangs over Berlin meant Germany would lose the war. Harker noticed the Mustang was fast but underpowered at altitude. He suggested the Merlin. Rolls-Royce management gave him the authority to try it. And from that simple sequence, one of the most important aircraft of the 20th century was born. The bomber crews who survived because Mustangs escorted them home probably never knew Harker's name. The ground soldiers who landed at Normandy under friendly skies certainly didn't. But all of them owed their lives, in part, to a test pilot who flew a disappointing American fighter for 30 minutes in April 1942 and came down with an idea. That's how wars are won. Not just by the soldiers and pilots who do the fighting, but by the engineers and designers and technicians who give them the tools they need. The Mustang was the right airplane in the right place at the right time. But it only became that airplane because someone saw its potential and found a way to unlock it. Wars are won by people who see possibilities where others see only problems. Ronald Harker saw a great airplane trapped inside a mediocre one, and he had the vision and the persistence to set it free. The men who flew the Mustang into combat understood what they had. They knew the aircraft's capabilities and limitations better than anyone. They knew how much fuel they could burn and still make it home. They knew the ideal altitude for combat. They knew when to press an attack and when to disengage. That knowledge was paid for in blood. Early missions taught hard lessons. Pilots who got too aggressive found themselves alone and surrounded. Pilots who stayed too long over target ran out of fuel on the way home. Pilots who didn't respect the enemy died quickly. The survivors learned. They developed tactics that worked. They shared those tactics with new pilots. They refined them through trial and error. By the spring of 1944, American fighter tactics were as sophisticated as any in the world. The Luftwaffe had excellent pilots. Many had years of combat experience. They flew good aircraft. They fought with skill and courage. But they couldn't overcome the fundamental disadvantages they faced. They were outnumbered. They were outranged. Their replacements were undertrained. Their fuel was running out. Their aircraft production, though impressive in raw numbers, couldn't keep pace with losses. The strategic situation was hopeless, and they knew it. Some fought on out of duty. Some fought because they had no choice. Some fought because they still believed in the cause. But knowledge of inevitable defeat spread through the ranks like poison. When the end came in May 1945, many Luftwaffe pilots simply surrendered their aircraft intact. Others flew to Allied airfields and gave up. A few fought to the last day, unwilling or unable to accept defeat. The Mustang pilots who survived the war came home to ticker-tape parades and grateful nations. They were heroes, and they deserved the recognition. But many struggled with what they'd done and what they'd seen. They'd killed men. They'd watched friends die. They'd bombed and strafed and destroyed with calculated efficiency. Some adjusted easily to peacetime. Others never did. The psychological cost of combat flying was immense and often invisible. A man could come home physically intact but mentally shattered. The term shell shock from the First World War had given way to combat fatigue in the Second. Today we call it PTSD. Whatever the name, the condition was real and devastating. Many former fighter pilots found that civilian life felt hollow after the intensity of combat. The stakes were never as high. The challenges were never as immediate. The camaraderie was never as strong. Some stayed in the military, making careers out of what they'd learned in war. Some became commercial pilots, finding in airlines a pale echo of their combat experience. Some walked away from aviation entirely, unable to separate flying from killing. But all of them carried the weight of what they'd done. They'd won the war. They'd saved countless lives by achieving air superiority. They'd destroyed an evil regime. And they'd done it by becoming killers themselves. That paradox defines the combat veteran's experience. You do terrible things for good reasons, and you live with the consequences forever. The Mustang made it possible. The aircraft gave them the range to reach the enemy, the performance to defeat him, the reliability to come home. Without it, the air war would have been lost. With it, victory became inevitable. In the end, that's the Mustang's legacy, not the speed or the range or the beauty of the design. The legacy is victory. The legacy is the defeat of Nazi Germany. The legacy is the thousands of lives saved because air superiority was achieved. When Colonel Don Blakesley looked down at Berlin through his canopy on March 4, 1944, he was witnessing a turning point in history. He probably didn't realize it at the time. He was focused on his fuel gauge and his formation and the mission at hand. But history was being made. The war was being won. And the Mustang was the weapon that made it possible. That's the story worth remembering. Not just the aircraft, but what it accomplished. Not just the pilots, but what they sacrificed. Not just the victory, but the cost of achieving it. The Mustang over Berlin meant freedom. It meant the end of tyranny. It meant hope for millions suffering under Nazi rule. And it meant that sometimes in the darkest moments, the right tool in the right hands can change everything.